countries are using our standards as a sort of benchmark. An example of that is Switzerland, which is developing accrual accounting based on our standards. South Africa, the United Kingdom certainly takes notice of our standards, and increasingly in New Zealand and Australia. So gradually, I think we are becoming more important, that there is no room for complacency. Currently, we have 4 strategic themes. The first is to develop a conceptual framework which is specific for the public sector. Because people have said to us, you should not be basing your standards on private sector standards, which are underpinned by a framework which does not recognise very important features of public sector operations, such as the fact that in the public sector, most assets are held for delivering services. Public sector specific projects, the second of our themes, and the third theme, which has been very important for the last 5 or 6 years, some would say it's had an exaggerated importance, is convergence with the standards of the International Accounting Standards Board. Lastly, we try and promote and communicate our standards, although we've not had very many resources to do that. And at the moment, we're starting to develop a new strategy for the next 3 years, 2010, 2012, and that's likely to emphasise public sector specific projects more. It probably will also mention the harmonisation with the statistical basis of accounting, because there can be a lot of confusion between accrual financial reporting in the financial statements and accrual accounting for the statistical basis. Lastly, we will have to maintain and improve our existing standards, and we are aware of a number of areas where improvement is necessary. I'll say a little bit about the conceptual framework, because this is a very, very important project for us. It is likely to dictate the approach we take for probably 10 or 15 years once it is finished. And we had a consultation paper issued last year, and that dealt with 4 topics. It dealt with the objectives of financial reporting and the users of financial statements in the public sector, the scope of financial reporting. Should financial reporting in the public sector include topics like narrative reporting, the non-financial performance of services, the sorts of things that you would not find in the private sector, where the emphasis is very much on the annual financial statements. The reporting entity, what should be the boundary for the financial reporting of the public sector? And lastly, the qualitative characteristics underpinning financial reporting. And we had 55 responses to that paper, which by our standards is quite a big response. We were quite pleased with it. And it was a very high quality response. The main things that people told us was that overall they supported creating this conceptual framework, but in some cases they qualified that support. That was mostly over scope. There were quite a lot of reservations over expanding the scope of financial reporting, particularly on non-financial service information and prospective information. When it came to users, they said to us, it's not like the private sector. You can't say that you have a primary class of users that is investors, and everybody else is satisfied by focusing on investors. There are a very large number of users in the public sector. And they said to us, you need to identify a priority group. But they had different views on what that priority group should be. So, identify a group, but we don't know exactly what that group is. And in terms of the approach, we had different views. We had a view that we were still being over-responsive to the private sector. That was typically a view from European respondents, especially those from France, Spain, Germany, Italy. Others said, you are departing too much from what the ISP is saying. And that was typically the response we got from Australia and New Zealand. And we will be looking again at those responses at our next meeting. We will be issuing 2 further consultation papers in 2010. They will be dealing firstly with elements, assets, liabilities, revenue, gains and losses, and we'll also be issuing a paper on measurement. Should we be using fair value? What does fair value mean in the public sector? Should we be using historical cost, as they do in the United States? And lastly, we will probably issue a paper on the cash basis, but we have not started work on that at the moment. Just to highlight some of the public sector specific projects, social benefits, that's a very important topic, but one on which we cannot actually agree. So now we are developing this with the conceptual framework. And the big issue there is, when do you recognise a liability for the service commitments of government? We've got a project on long-term fiscal sustainability. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And we have a project on service concessions. And that is important because the ISD interpretation, IFRIC 12, only deals with service concessions from the perspective of the operator, the private sector entity. So we are developing an exposure draft which will look at this from the perspective of government, of the grantor. And I know that service concessions have been particularly significant in Spain. And we had a task force, a little group, to oversee this project. And Monica Sanz from the Ministry of Finance in Madrid was a member of that task force, and we were very grateful to Monica for her work on that task force. And lastly, we will probably start some work on narrative reporting and non-financial performance reporting. But because people have said to us, we think we should be very careful in these areas, we will probably develop guidance, not compulsory requirements. The reason why we're doing the work on long-term fiscal sustainability, and I realise the word fiscal is a word which has different meanings, I think, in European countries than Anglophone countries. For Anglophone countries, it means both inflows and outflows. I think often in Europe it means just taxation, but this is looking at both outflows and inflows of resources to governments. The reason for this is that we couldn't come to a view on when and how great liabilities are for social benefits, for important activities like pensions. Fiscal sustainability reporting has become quite a significant feature of public reporting